Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. It's great to see you all and to see people already viewing and get into the chat box, say hi, ask your questions. You know how it all works. So it's good to see you all. We are all here with the whole team, bar John Mackay, who is having a little bit of a break this week and very rightly deserved. But we do have Dr. Diane Eager, we have Craig Hawkins, we have Dr. Glenn Wilson, and we have Sam Jenkins as well, all ready to give you some great content this evening on Creation Conversations, where our topic is creation, the blooming proof, specifically talking about flowers and all sorts of beauty and design and everything else that you find in these flowers. So the program will be heavily led by our two biologists on the team, Dr. Diane Eager and Craig Hawkins, but we've got some content from Glenn, so there's a connection there which he'll be speaking on, and I've got a few examples as well of some different types of nuts and seeds which I'll bring as well. So should be a good program. Thank you all very much for everybody who's jumping in the chat already, and we will launch straight into it with Dr. Diane Eager, who will be giving us our first session called Blooming Proof. So Diane, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. We are looking at the blooming proof of creation because there's plenty of it. And because John is not here, I'm going to talk about some of the things that John has grown in his garden, because if he was here, he would like to share them with us. And John likes to grow weird plants. And I mean really weird plants, bizarre blooms. These are orchid plants that do all sorts of strange things like shooting and drugs and kidnapping. And so we will get to some pretty flowers later on. But while John's not here, let's have a look at some of these bizarre blooms. Now, this is an orchid called a catasetum. And this is an interesting plant in that it has separate male and female plants. And this is the male plant, so it produces pollen. Now, it's a bit hard to see where the pollen is in this photo, but if you have a look at it from sort of up the nose, as it were, you can see that the pollen is there underneath that sort of hood. But below that, you can see there is a spike that's sticking out, and that's actually a trigger. And so an insect, in this case a bee, will fly into this flower, and you can see there's a curved hollow place where the bee can land, but it doesn't take much movement before it actually triggers that little spike there, and the flower literally shoots the bee with quite a deal of force. And on the pollen there is a blob of glue, and the glue sticks the pollen onto the back of the bee. Now, and it's quite forceful, actually. Now, that obviously sort of makes the bee feel quite uncomfortable. So these things are a bit wary about coming back to another flower that's like that. But the plant has a way around that. As I said, it has male flowers and female flowers. And the female flowers are quite different. They look very different to the male flowers. So a bee will fly into that, and if it has pollen on its back, the pollen actually sticks up, and inside the hollow space in this flower, there is a little groove which is just the right size for grabbing hold of that pollen and ripping it off the bee's back. So the bee gets shot and then it gets ripped off. Not a very friendly plant, but very interesting plant and a brilliant piece of design, because if you think about that, how would that evolve step by step? For a start, you've got to have both the male and the female flowers with exactly the right design and exactly the right shape and size for this to work. And it's all got to work in one generation. You only get one generation to get this right. Otherwise, this whole plant, both male and female, would be extinct. Now, here's another weird looking plant. this is not the most prepossessing plant that you could ever go wandering around. I mean, if someone gave you a bunch of these and said, here are some flowers that remind me of you, I don't know that you'd be impressed. Although if you could smell the flowers, you might be impressed. They have the most amazing, strong, sweet smell. In fact, I remember many years ago, we got a film producer to come and film some of these, because one day we would like to make a whole video about orchids and all the brilliant and amazing design that's in them and all the beauty. And so when this plant was blooming, we got our video producer friend to come over and film this plant, and we didn't want it to get damaged overnight. So we put it inside so that it would be protected. But a couple of hours later, we all looked at one another and said, no, that plant has got to go back outside. The fragrance is just so strong and so powerful. And that's an important part of the way this plant works. Now, it is a really odd looking plant. I mean, one of the odd looking things about it is that it flowers through its roots. That's weird enough. But look at the complex three-dimensional shape. It really is very strange. And the other interesting thing is whereabouts its pollen is. It's not in the middle of the flower. It's right at the bottom of that long curved column that projects over one side, and the pollen is right there at the bottom. Now, in order for a bee to pick up this pollen, it has to land in the middle of the flower, but that's a long way from the pollen. But again, the plant has ways and means of making sure that the bee picks up the pollen, because in that hollow place there where the bee can land, there isn't any nectar. Most flowers produce nectar. That's what bees are encouraged to come and land on flowers for. This plant produces fragrant oils. And so the bee is attracted by this very strong fragrance, and it will actually deliberately collect the fragrant oils. And it's so powerful, this scent, that eventually the bee will just absorb the fragrant oils. It's got a little furry part on its legs where it will collect the fragrant oil, and it just sort of goes, ah, and it literally falls through the flower. So it's a bit like this. The bee comes in and it will gather the perfume. And the really interesting thing is the bee gathers this perfume and then uses that to attract a female bee. So it goes to the perfume shop, as it were, gathers some perfume, and its legs have these sort of little brushes that are designed to pick up these fragrant oils, and it just gets so overwhelmed it literally falls through the flower and gathers the pollen on its way. It's just the right size for the pollen to stick to its back. Very weird. But then it's only done half the job. It's then got to go to another flower and it will get the same treatment. Now, apparently gathering perfume and falling through the flower isn't quite as bad as being shot. So this plant does actually collect pollen with the same blooms. It doesn't have male and female blooms. And so on the end of one of those columns where the pollen used to be for the bee to collect, after the bee has collected it, behind that there are these two little pouches. And so if a bee that is loaded with pollen, as it were, falls through the flower, the pollen will get collected in those two little pouches, and that will fertilize the flower. Really, truly amazing design. And again, you have to get this all right within one generation. You can't evolve it step by step. Now, here's another plant. Now, this one doesn't shoot things or drug them with overwhelming perfume. This one captures them and kidnaps them, but it does eventually let them go. Now, this is a green hood orchid. It's actually a very, very tiny, weeny little orchid, and it's fertilized by mosquitoes. So if you've ever wondered why the Lord made mosquitoes, the answer is not to bite you. In fact, male mosquitoes don't bite. Female mosquitoes do bite, but only when they need iron and protein to lay eggs. Most of the time, mosquitoes live on plant juices and plant nectar. So this particular little orchid is attractive to mosquitoes. So a mosquito will fly in, and the only place it can land properly is on that little lip or that little tongue that's sticking out just above the V-shaped area in the middle of the flower there. And when it does that, this is so well balanced that that will fall backwards and throw the mosquito into the middle of the flower. And this was an observation that John Mackay very carefully sat down and watched that and took these photos. So I can't take any credit for these photos. John Mackay took them and did this research. It's just he's not here tonight, so that's why I'm showing them to you. And you can see that sort of lever-shaped tongue there has flipped back, flipped the mosquito into the bottom of the flower, and at the bottom of the flower there is some nectar. So the little mosquito will crawl around there, get a good drink of mosquito, but then how is it going to get out of the flower? Well, in fact, the only way it can get out of the flower is to crawl up the back there, and most of the sides of this flower are quite slippery, but there is a track where it's not slippery, so the mosquito can actually crawl up the back, and it has to go through that cylindrical part right at the top of the flower, and you can see just a little yellow knob there at the top. That is the pollen of the flower. So the mosquito will crawl up the back there where there's a path that has a sort of matte finish rather than a shiny, slippery finish, and it will go through that tunnel and it will collect the pollen on its way out and fly away. Now the flower will then reset itself because, again, the mosquito has only done half the job. The flower has only done half the job of giving away its pollen. It has to collect some pollen as well in order for the flower to be fertilized. And when another mosquito comes along, this time carrying pollen, the flower will collect the pollen, which will then go down into the stem underneath, and you can see there's an expanded area down there. That's where the ovary of the plant is, and that will be fertilized and produce seed for the next generation, which will produce more of these after their kind. Really brilliant system. However, John doesn't only breed weird plants, he does actually breed some very beautiful plants, so we won't pour scorn on his weird plants. Here are some other plants from John's garden. Aren't they lovely? Absolutely beautiful. And you can come and see some of these at our Jurassic Ark site as well. Really glorious pieces of God's creation that are just a delight to the eyes. Really does your heart good to come along and see these. And the interesting thing is to see how a lot of these have tree bark in the background. These are what are called epiphytes. They're not parasites. They live on trees, but they don't actually take anything from them. They just use the trees as a sort of structure. And I've always wondered how the evolutionists worked out that the first flowering plants supposedly grew in the ground with roots, just like most flowering plants. What was it that made orchids decide to climb trees and live on those? No, they were designed as epiphytes, and they are brilliantly designed to live on trees, but without doing any damage to them, and just add that extra piece of beauty to already lovely trees. And but I do like beautiful blooms, and they're not only beautiful to look at, they also offer some other things. Now, we've already looked at one particularly fragrant orchid, but there are also other fragrances and interesting things that plants offer besides beauty. And I love to grow sweet peas, and they are a very fragrant flower. In a place I used to live, I used to grow sweet peas next to a little path that went past the front of my place, and I loved watching people walk along this path, and they'd slow down and take a few deep breaths when the sweet pea season was on, because they were just so lovely. Now, the skeptics will say that, oh, well, flowers just produce scents, lovely perfumes, and have beautiful colors in order to attract insects. That's true, they do. But sweet peas are really interesting. Now, can you see any pollen in these flowers? And one day I was watching some bees flying around, not in my garden, but in somebody else's garden, and a bee landed on one of these flowers, and you can almost see the frustration in its face. I've landed on this beautiful, fragrant flower, but I can't find any pollen. And that is because the pollen is completely enclosed in these little chambers here. And these flowers are self-fertile. They'll fertilize themselves. They don't need insects, but they do have color and they do have fragrance, and they are really beautiful and attractive. So why did God make sweet peas? Well, because they're pretty. I'm sure there are other reasons as well. But yeah, beauty is important. And there you can see I've opened that enclosed chamber, and you can see the pollen in these flowers. So they do have pollen, and they do have a pollen receiving stigma, but they are self-fertile, and you can just leave them alone and they will fertilize themselves and you'll get more sweet peas. Now, I love water lilies, and some of those are fragrant as well. But I just love the beautiful symmetry and the artistic colors that you get in them. And I'm sure God really enjoyed making water lilies. They are so beautiful that he's floated them on water, and you get to see them twice, which is really nice. But water lilies also have another interesting property. They are literally floral furnaces. Underneath the flower, they will burn starch, and that produces heat. So they are warm flowers, and that is a good thing. Why would you want to be a warm flower when you float in the middle of a pond? Well, that is because flowers have to be fertilized by, these flowers do have to be fertilized by insects. They're not self-fertile. And so we had a look at some of these, and you can see some really tiny, weeny little bees. These are little native bees. They do produce honey, but not a lot. They are really tiny little bees. You can see how tiny they are, and they do produce pollen. You can see one of them there has produced some, not produced pollen, they collect pollen, and just like honeybees do, and they actually have pollen baskets on their legs. But for a tiny little insect to fly over water, they can very easily lose heat. But if they land in a nice warm flower, they can sit there and get warmed up again, because they then have to fly back over the water to another flower in order to do the work of fertilization. So at Creation Research, we like to observe things and measure things. So we decided we'd have a look at how well the water lilies heat their flowers. So here are a few temperature measurements. Now, this is a lovely warm day in Queensland. It's 26.2 degrees just out in the air. And in Johns Pond, the temperature goes down to 19.7, which is not a bad temperature to swim in, but for a tiny little insect, that is enough where it would lose heat. But in the flower, look at the temperature there, 32.8. So the flower is 12 degrees hotter. What's 32 minus 19? It's a little bit more than that, isn't it? Okay, compared with the water around it. That is a very effective floral furnace, and it's giving the tiny little native bees and any other insects that happen to fly into it a very warm welcome. These flowers are not unique in producing heat. There are quite a few other flowers that will do this in order to give their pollinators a little bit of an extra energy boost. here is one of them, but this one doesn't burn starch to produce heat. Anyone recognize these? These are snapdragons or antirrhinums, and they are a very interesting flower as well because they have solar heating. If you look at the surface of these, you can see it has a sort of slightly furry matte finish, and that is because the petals aren't smooth and completely shiny. If you look at these under a microscope, the petals are covered with these sort of cone-shaped projections, and these will absorb heat from the sun. So these are solar heated flowers. And this is an illustration from a number of scientific papers have been written about this, and some scientists deliberately bred a mutant flower that didn't produce these cones, so it has these flat cells, and then looked at the properties of the wild type plant. That's the plant with the cone-shaped cells and the flat ones, to see if it made a difference to how well this plant lives, how well it can be pollinated. And it does make a difference. Now, this is another flower whose pollen is hidden, but it doesn't fertilize itself. It does need an insect to come along and literally pry it apart. So the bees are attracted to this flower and they will push their way into it. There is pollen at the base of that flower and nectar. And in order to get a good grip on this flower, all those cone-shaped, that cone-shaped matte surface actually does help the bees get a good grip. And so the scientists have actually tested the flowers with the normal cone-shaped cells on their petals and the flat ones. And they have found it's enough to make a difference as to whether the bees can get a good grip on the flowers and also whether they can enjoy the solar heating. Now, I once listened to an interview with one of the botanists who was studying these flowers, and she made this comment at the end of her interview. The implication that we're really most excited about is that flowers are cleverer than we thought they were. Now, I don't think that is a particularly clever statement, actually, because what this person was observing was the work of a clever creator. So that is not such a clever statement. And there is a verse in the Bible that reminds us that people who ignore the evidence of creation, well, they call themselves wise, but really they have become fools. And how sad that is when they are studying these wondrous and brilliant designs of the Creator, but not coming to know the Creator as a person. And this is not just a frivolous sort of thing to study flowers, much as I love looking at them, love photographing them, but it is important to remember that nearly all the plant foods that we eat come from flowering plants. I can only think of a couple of non-flowering plants that we eat. One would be seaweed, of course, and pine nuts would be another one, because conifers do produce pollen, but they don't have flowers. But you think of all of the fruits, nuts, seeds, all the grains that we eat, all of those are flowering plants. And we are told in Genesis that the Lord God made to spring up in the Garden of Eden, particularly every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, and that applies to all of the other plants that he made. And remember, there are those two aspects which obviously meant something to God, because when God had finished the creation, he declared it to be very good. So it is important that the plants are pleasing to the sight. That is good for our soul, that's good for us, and they are also good for food. And Glenn has some interesting things to share about crop breeding later on for us, but if we can come back to us now. And Craig has some really interesting things about one of those plants that has interesting ways and means of ensuring that it gets pollinated as well.
Diane, I was wondering if cleverer is a real word. Is cleverer for the scientists to say cleverer?
Cleverer.
Clever.
I don't know.
More clever. Yeah, I don't know.
More
I'm
clever.
not clever enough to know.
Cleverer. Yeah,
We'll
yeah,
make it a word for you, Craig. I'll contact Oxford.
yeah. Have to look that one up. But anyway, maybe that's another thing that wasn't too clever.
Thank you very much for that, Diane. That was great. Yeah, we're going to go straight on to Craig's section, and there's a rather fascinating section here in
Yes.
the video. So we're going to go over to Craig now, and then we'll have a bit of a break for some questions and answers, I think. So, Craig, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I think what Sam's put up there in the chat is great. The passage from Luke that says, "Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks,
indeed.
Sam. That's awesome. And that's the scriptures just telling us how magnificent flowers are, and how beautiful they are, but also how intricate they are.
Yes.
And so, thanks, Diane. I thought that was fantastic. I'll just get my slides up. I've got one on an Australian flower. All correct. Thanks, Shoggiwa. Always rely on Shoggiwa to confirm cleverer is a real word. There you go.
Oh, good.
Okay, so I just want to talk about the trigger plant. That's not a trigger plant or a trigger flower, but I thought it was a nice picture of a bee, so I'll put it up there. But the trigger plant is Stylidium graminifolium, which is widespread across Australia. In fact, there's, I think, 150 or so trigger plants, mostly in Australia, that occur across the continent and in Tasmania as well. I'll just see if I can get this one going. There we go. So they're Australian perennials. When they're not flowering, they really just look like grass. So they're not a lily technically, but they very much in their leafing system look like lilies. And their pollination system, from where they get their name from, the trigger plant, is operating off a fast-acting trigger, which I want to describe. That's the beautiful flower that you see. They can grow up to knee height or even a little bit bigger than that. So it uses a trigger to hit an insect with the pollen. The pollen gets deposited on the back of the insect, it's not on the legs as such, as in a lot of other flowers. Hits it on its back, and then the insect will fly off to another flower to get hit again with a trigger that is then the female part. So we'll talk about that as we go. So I didn't want to copy some brilliant photos that are out there. And if you want to go and have a look at this, there's a website called Life in a Southern Forest. And it's got some magnificent up-close photos of how these plants work. But I sought permission, but didn't get it in time. So this is my magnificent art just to impress you all with. So look out, Steve Cardno. But here's the parts of the flower. You've got obviously the petals, which, as in most flowers, seem to have some role in attracting insects. You've got the throat appendages there. They seem to be guides to guide the insect into the nectar well there in the centre of the flower. But also those throat appendages seem to discourage insects that are not good for the pollination of the flower from getting into the nectar well. The actual flower stem is quite interesting. The column is a combination or a fusing of the male and the female part. So just the very basics of flower structure is the anthers, which produce the pollen. That's the male part. The stigma is the female receptive part. And then usually the pollen, when it lands on the stigma, will send a tube down the floral tube and fertilise the female seeds sort of deep down in the flower. So these two parts are fused together on this particular flower to produce the trigger, and that's what fires. So we'll have a look at this. This is how the insect comes in, and the insect is attracted to the really rich nectar that's in the nectar well. Seems to really love it, and it's so good that the insect seems to visit many flowers on the same stem and then fly off to other stems, and on they go. It's guided in there by those throat appendages. It can sit and land and on the petals there. It's all perfectly designed for them to do that. And when it puts its like proboscis into the nectar well, that sets off cells in there. It causes them to have low pressure on that first bend in the trigger, and it fires up and hits the insect on the back there. It's very, very fast. In fact, it's approximately, it takes about 10 milliseconds, which is 1/100th of a second. Now, when you set this off, it can actually reset. So the trigger will reset, and it takes about 10 minutes to do that. So when you see in the little video I've got in a minute where we set it off, we're not really destroying the opportunity of that plant to pollinate. But I think that's quite incredible that they can reset as well. And the interesting thing is that the slap on the back, which would have to be quite firm for a little insect, does not deter it. So maybe that's suggesting, one, how good the nectar is, but also I suppose it's a fairly firm back on most of those insects with the cuticle that they have. Now, with the pressure of the trigger on the back of the insect, it stays there, and the insect has to back out of where it's been hit, and that means the pollen sort of scraped off the male part and deposited on the back nice and firmly. And the other interesting thing, if an insect just lands on the flower, it doesn't set the trigger off. It actually has to be feeding in the nectar well to set the trigger off. Okay, so to take that to the next level, there's an order in the flowering of the trigger plant. So the lower flowers are the first to develop. Now, it doesn't self-pollinate because you've got the male anthers right next to the female stigma, and that could cause self-pollination within the one flower, or even if the insect went from one flower to the next flower on the same plant, the plant is still basically self-pollinating. Now, the trouble with that is that can cause like inbreeding depression, and reduce genetic diversity. But God's worked it out that he wants a broad genetic diversity across organisms as much as possible, and so he's worked it out in this amazing design that the flowers don't self-pollinate. One, because the anthers develop the pollen first, and the stigma is covered up. The female part is covered up while the anthers are producing pollen. And then once they're spent, then the stigma starts to develop and can receive pollen from another flower when the insect then repeats it. So the trigger is going off, one, to release the pollen, and then on a later occasion to receive pollen. But the other thing is there's different stages in the flowering. The lower ones are the first to produce the anthers, and then as the other flowers develop up the stem, they become the receptive part. What's happened there? Sorry, I'll go back to that. There we go. Stage 2, so that's the younger flower that's starting to produce pollen. And then that's the youngest one. So the anthers are full of pollen. but the stigma's not receptive. The stigma's receptive at this stage now on the bottom one. But the really interesting thing is, and it's hard to explain why, maybe there's a difference in the nectar well, but the bee or the insect lands on the bottom flower first. So in other words, it's bringing pollen from a previous flower, and it lands on the bottom flower with that pollen, and then it moves up the stem, visiting the flowers as it goes up with pollen from the other flower. Won't matter because they're not receptive at this stage. It'll pick that pollen off and then fly off to another flower and visit the bottom flower on that other stem. So that's an incredible thing that the insects know to do, and I don't think you can explain that in any other way except magnificent design. As I was studying this, I came across a quote from one of the people researching it, and they said, oh, sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. They said this, after going through all the amazing parts of the trigger plant flower and how it works, evolution, a masterclass in design. Now,
Wow.
that's an incredible statement, because design always comes about from a designer that has an intent, a plan, and a purpose, which are all attributes of intelligence. So I don't know how you can say that blind, random chance evolution is a masterclass in design. But as Diane was saying, I guess that's part of this foolishness that starts to creep in. You can study and look and take close-up photos of magnificent design and then call it evolution. Mm-hmm. Incredible. Well, Sam, if we can perhaps show the video now. This is showing you how fast the trigger is. So it'll show you them firing, and then right at the end, try and slow it up to the slowest speed that we could, and it's still quite fast. So let's have a look at this.
Gotcha.
Oh yeah, I'm filming.
Got me. You're kidding me. Got that?
Yeah. This will be a good one if we get it.
Yeah, he's already triggered, I think.
Okay, so come back to us, I think now.
Yeah. It reminds me a
Sam?
bit like of a Venus flytrap. A similar sort of like a mechanism, like it's tickled and then it activates.
Yeah, it quite possibly is, although this one's about pollen and not actually trapping the insect itself.
No, that's true. No, I was meaning the mechanism of things.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
so-
incredibly quick. Mm.
So how much did you slow that down, Sam?
So that was the original. I would probably say that was about 15% speed of real time.
Mm.
So we're probably talking about about a tenth of a second for that to activate, I'd say.
I think there's a bit of a movement amongst bees to try and stop this happening, because they're finding in their old age they're getting sort of brain injuries and concussion.
Bees against catapult.
Mm.
All right. Well, that's been a great program so far. Thank you very much to both Diane and Craig. That's great. And thank you for everybody who's engaging in the chat as well. So let's go over to some questions now, Sam, and perhaps some thank yous first of all, but then into some questions.
All right. Well, we've got to highlight this comment coming from Douglas Boffey. Oops, I only just realised I was missing creation research. Heil. It's never a good time when you're missing creation conversations. But welcome to the stream. Welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone here.
Hello.
And we're going to kick it off with got to give it some thanks for Doki Doki coming in strong with 2 US Buckaroos, a pair character turning around, waving his hand, saying, "Hey, you," while lowering his glasses. Hey, you. How's that? And then we've also got another one coming in from Doki Doki Bubble Club, 149 US Buckaroos, a red rose.
Oh,
Right,
how
very,
appropriate.
very
Lovely.
appropriate.
Yeah.
Lovely, jubbly.
Mm.
He sent in a few questions himself, and we've got this one coming from Doki. Question: is there a problem in assuming the flowers surviving in the harshest of environments are the best examples of evolution in flowering plants?
Well, I suppose it is a case of survival of the fittest, but that doesn't explain how they got to be flowering in the first place. So survival of the fittest and natural selection, those are the same thing. Those are real processes, but they won't make anything evolve, and they certainly won't create anything new. They just explain why some things survive and other things die out.
It's similar to the argument with the why has Australia got such unique creatures. You'll find lots of unique examples of design in these flowers that are struggling to survive, or rather flowers that are found in harsh environments, just like you have examples of unique creatures in Australia. But the evidence is very clear that they didn't evolve there. It's the last place that they're able to survive. You find this with a lot of the flowering plants and stuff as well, and you can see examples of modern examples of this where they've you've artificially manipulated flowers for a certain condition. You'll find that they almost always lose another trait of some description. Take, for instance, if you try and breed thornless blackberries, for instance, not only if you just let them be will they revert back to producing thorns, but you'll find that in the thornless blackberry varieties, the blackberries taste absolutely awful. So you're going to lose something somewhere. It's an example of that natural selection, or in the case of the thornless blackberries, artificial selection. You're just highlighting one particular trait over another. You're not actually evolving or adding any new information.
And I don't think you can gradually and slowly evolve features to survive something that is otherwise going to kill you. If you don't already have those features, then you're dead. So
yes, that's right.
so you've already got to have those features. You don't slowly evolve them or randomly evolve them. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
No. Good point. All right, Sam, let's have another question.
All right. Well, we've got another one coming from Doki Doki. This one's a bit of an interesting one, a bit more of a history lesson. He asked, how did botany and botanist get its name?
Maybe we should ask William Turner, the father of botany, who in the 1500s, a Christian man, believed in the Bible. It's considered the father of botany. You know, if we were living in the day of Noah or Adam, well, we'd live long enough that we could have asked him. Wouldn't that be awesome?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, the quick answer is that botany comes from the Latin botanicus, which comes from the Greek botanikoi or botanicae, which is reference to pasture. Generically plants, but I think if I remember correctly, when I did botany, it was more the Greek root word had more to do with pasture or grassland or reference to plants and growth, in some way. So you'll find when a lot of these sciences, the modern kind of sciences, became determined in around the 15 to 1600s, they would borrow a lot of the sort of Greek and Latin words in order to describe what they were doing.
In the 1690s, it came from the word botanic.
Yes.
I think that's
That's the Greek word for grass or pasture.
Yes, and in Victorian times, it was very popular to go out and look for interesting plants out in the countryside, and that was called botanizing.
Yeah. I think it was botanicus from botanicos, and then Anyway,
You want to be careful saying that these days.
yeah. You won't go there. Yeah. Anyway, good stuff. Any more questions, Sam? Before we move
All
on?
right, we'll get the third question from Doki out the way. Question: did plants make thorns to protect themselves?
Quick answer is no.
On episode 7, I believe, of around the museum.
Yes,
Yes,
there's plenty of thorny plants that do get eaten, actually. Sheep are quite fond of a feed of roses.
Camels, acacia, giraffes.
Yes.
You know, they're all Well, Diane, why don't you just briefly run down where thorns come from?
Well, we are actually told that thorns were part of God's judgment. When God cursed the ground, he said that it would produce thorns and thistles. And we know that thorns, in spite of the fact sheep might like to eat roses, rose thorns can be quite dangerous to us because they pierce our skin and we can get infections. So they are part of God's judgment. And if you look at thorns in terms of the internal structure of plants, what you find is that you've got a mismatch of growth of different parts of the plants. Now, some thorns, like on a lemon tree, or some spines, are actually where the internal plumbing that is the support structure for leaves and for stems just starts to grow and then gives up. And you have a mismatch between the soft green tissue where all the photosynthesizing part of the other leaf is. Just doesn't match with the vascular tissue. That's the internal plumbing. That's the support structure for it. And so it sticks out the sides, or the plant starts to grow some branches or leaf bases, and they just give up. So in fact, that is a loss of structure and a mismatch in their growth. Things like the blackberries and rose thorns, they are an overgrowth of surface tissue. So again, it's a degeneration. The plant has changed, but it hasn't gained anything. It certainly hasn't gained anything functional. So thorns and thistles are a degeneration. That's why we can say that they are part of the good to bad to worse history of the world. They weren't there in the first place. God made it clear they were part of his judgment, and we can see that they are a degenerative process and a degenerative structure.
And they don't seem to stop any of the animals other than us. If you ever try to eat blackberries, and I hate to disagree with Joe, but I grow thornless blackberries. They now have been able to manipulate them by breeding to be very tasty. But out in the natural environment, yes, they wouldn't do that. They're able to breed them to do that.
Well, that took a bit of creative design to be able to do that, to make them.
Exactly,
Took some intelligence and some work. Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great stuff. All right. Well, let's carry on then. If we've come to the end of questions for the moment, just see where we are with this. There we go. All right. Let's go over to Glenn now.
All right. Let's see if I can
his little section.
share my.
Over to you.
Let's do some soil science.
Soil science.
Well, oh my goodness,
sort
all
of.
kinds of things up here. Well, I do have degrees in soil science, but my first degree was in plant science. So I've got my BS degree is in plant science. Now, keep in mind, this was almost 50 years ago, 45 years ago. So much has changed.
Who's
But
counting?
I wanted to present a little bit just on some of the things on flowering. And we're going to talk about the different types of change, the different types that, they would claim to be evolution. Type 1 change is just adaptation. It's just any change. But there's, as we talked about, no additional genetic information formed. It's a lost genetic information. Type 2, and both of these first two are really the principles of crop breeding. And that's transfer of genetic information from one organism to the other. And then type 3 is the macroevolution. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I took a lot of crop breeding classes. I took plant physiology, plant pathology, but I don't even remember which all courses I took. Sugarcane breeding, cotton breeding. I took like 3 or 4 different breeding classes. There's various objectives. You tend to think of it as, well, we're breeding for higher yields or improved quality, but it's much more specific to that than that. Oftentimes, it's just for the characteristics of the plant so that it can be mechanically harvested, and others for moisture stress or for resisting toxic substances in the soil. And more recently, it's for heat tolerance. There's a lot of breeding in that area. We've already talked a little bit about the flowers, so I'm going to talk about the breeding practices with these perfect flowers that have both the male and the female parts. And it's just as Craig talked about with the anther, where the pollen is developed and getting it to go into the female part that starts with the stigma, and then it's got this long tube, and then it goes down into the ovaries. And so plant breeders need to take advantage of this. And in some crops like corn, it's quite easy because you've got the male part quite a distance from the female part. And so if you want to do, one way is just cut off the tops of the corn or put a bag over it. Or once they do the artificial breeding of them, you can cover them to keep the silks from being fertilized by any other plants by mistake. So type 1, it can be produced in many different ways. It does it naturally. Type 1 is just a change. It's a loss of pre-existing genetic information. As I mentioned in the corn, you can just go through and not let them reproduce by cutting the tops off or putting a bag over the silk. But it can do this naturally. Just, the examples of, bright colored males are easier seen and the predators eat them before they can breed. Well, that's not creating new genetic information. That's a loss of genetic information. There's also tried to do this by mutations. We know the example of the fruit flies. They ionized radiation to produce thousands of different types of fruit flies, but they were all still fruit flies. This was a loss of pre-existing information. They do this with seeds as well. But again, it's not producing a new genetic information. So in the breeding, I was just amazed when we go out and visit the actual breeders, and they would show us the techniques. And a few times we got to practice the techniques because, it's quite intricate. And I don't know how these crop breeders did it, because you have to have really good eyes and very steady hands to be able to go into the flowering parts and do this. But you can cross plants or cross animals. And hybridization is just doing this with 2 plants of dissimilar genotypes. And so you would take the pollen from one, and then you have to introduce it to the stamen of the others. And got to see these guys doing this out in many different fields. The one that I was amazed with was out in the rice fields, because one, you're out in a flooded field. But at LSU, the guy doing it was, I think, in his 70s. And here I was in my 20s thinking, I don't think I have the eyesight to be able to see to be able to go into these little flowers. Now, this isn't a rice flower, but the rice ones were even smaller that he was having to deal with. I was amazed with how they did this. One of the things that, though, that I was amazed with is how the crop breeders would travel all over the world looking for a native version of their plant. The cotton breeders, I remember, would go to Australia and travel throughout the outback looking for native versions of cotton, because while they might teach about evolution, they instinctively knew that plants only reproduce after their own kind. So if they wanted a unique trait that they wanted to put into a plant, something that was more resistant to a disease or more resistant to a herbicide, they needed to find a native plant that was also in the cotton family. And the same was true with sugarcane, rice. They would travel all over the world looking for plants that had a different genotype, a different trait, and they wanted to be able to capture that. The other thing I was amazed with is that, for most of these, you get one season to be able to make the cross, grow the seed, next year plant that seed, grow that crop, select the traits, and then do it all over again. And it may be 15 years of doing that before they would finally have something that they accomplished in their career. And many times they would do this for 15 years and then find that they really didn't make any success and didn't have anything to show for it. So I was definitely glad I didn't go into plant science and I shifted over to crop science. The other was type 3. That was the macroevolution. And I just have a few quotes here. Biophysicist, Dr. Lee Spittner, he said that type 3 has never been observed. No one's ever even been able to develop a mechanism to force type 3. And that is macroevolution, because it takes the generation of large quantities of new genetic information, and all of it, as Diane and Craig were showing, has to be fully functional from the beginning for you to have macroevolution. John Stanford's the one who's famous for developing the gene gun, very well known for his genetic research. And he said, genetic entropy plus natural selection make Darwinism style evolution, macroevolution, scientifically impossible. That's why no one's ever been able to set up an experiment to make this happen. So that one has definitely been canceled. So we can go back, Sam, and open it up for questions or more comments.
All right, there we go. Great stuff. Thank you very much for that, Glenn. That was fantastic. And thank you very much to the whole panel tonight for all of their contributions. I've just
thanks,
got a couple
Joe.
of...
Nice
well,
to
you as well.
nice to know, mate.
You're awesome, Sam.
Oh no, it's my impersonations of the pair characters exaggerating, stretching their arms forward to offer a cup of coffee. You know.
There's actually a question that's just come through, which I just dashed off to go and grab a prop for, which was about. Whoops, where's it gone? Hold on, let's try and find it. It's disappeared. Is there one about wounds, Sam? Is they there? Is that?
Oh
there?
yeah, that one from
There
Doki.
Okay, why do the medieval and mythical movie characters shove plants into a wound for a quick fix? I couldn't think of a medieval or mythical movie in which they do that, but I'm sure they do because I'm not up there on my medieval or mythical movies.
Lord of the Rings.
Do they do that in Lord of the Rings?
Isn't it Athelas?
That's right. They have a plant thing.
King's foil.
Yeah. Anyway, there is some truth to it, because I do know that this was a well-known medieval fix. If we hold that up, I don't know if you can just about see what that is. Well done if you've got it. This is actually a dried up puffball fungus. We have a whole fungus collection because I'm still very much into fungus, but was very heavily into fungus collecting and preserving and recording in my teenage years. That's what I spent most of my time between the age of 12 and 16, was out with sort of like 60-year-old people looking for mushrooms. But anyway, these are some of the collections that I've got. This is a dried up puffball. So if you know the puffball, the big white, fairly firm fungus can get really big, very good eating. This is what happens when they mature. And you might just be able to see if we can get it into focus there. You might just be able to see. Let's see. There we go. There it is in focus. Let's see if we can keep it in focus. Can you see the? Oh, you can just about see there. Can you see all the spores coming off?
Yes.
That actually highlights that quite nicely. There we go. Those are all the spores. So it's very, very light. It feels like a very light sponge. And as the wind sort of blows it around, it distributes all of its spores. So that's how it does its spore dispersal. However, these were well known in medieval times. If you were a farrier or a squire who looked after the horses of the knights, or even just a general soldier, you would often keep these in your pouch. One of these. Why? Well, if you got injured or if your horse got injured, you'd take a big chunk of this and you'd press it up into the wound and bind it with a bandage, obviously whatever you can find or rip up. And they did this because this will actually help it to heal. And it does two specific things, which we've found out in modern times what it does. The first one is it is antiseptic. So the spores and the material is actually antiseptic. They are, as most fungus is, they are antibacterial. You think of like penicillin, right, which is the original antibiotic. It's a fungus. You'll find that lots of fungus are actually antibacterial and antiseptic in that way. So antibiotic as well. So that's the first thing. It is an antibiotic. It is antiseptic, so that helps. Secondly, it's also soft and spongy, right? So it actually will absorb blood and can absorb quite a lot of blood. So it can help with the clotting. That is creating a barrier to stop blood from flowing so that the blood can actually clot and begin to produce the scab. So it's actually really very, very useful, little things like this. And it's amazing the kind of usefulness that God has designed into some of these things. So, Sam, you actually mentioned earlier about a fungus, which I think we'd do very well to actually include one day. Maybe in the new year, a specific fungus related creation conversations, not just looking at the design of fungus, but also asking things like, well, the example that you brought up, Sam, was cordyceps. I have an example of cordyceps somewhere in the museum collection. What does that do, Sam?
So a cordyceps is essentially it can be otherwise better known as, more commonly, the zombie ant fungus. So the idea of the fungus is it basically infiltrates the ant's body, either through the skin or through ingesting, and then the fungus will actually grow through the nervous system and grow through the brain and control the ant to get it to where it needs to go, and basically it becomes like a zombie. And this has been explored in the video game and subsequent TV show The Last of Us, which has been a smash hit, but took the concept of the zombie ant virus and applied it to if it happened to humans, which is a bit of a different take on the zombie genre, which is a bit relevant because we're coming up to Halloween. But anyway, but this article was talking about how this fungus can now sort of has evolved the ability to affect living tissue as opposed to just dead tissue. So yeah, that's what I was sending over. But I think it would be good to do a full program on sort of fungus and cordyceps and where's that in a good world. That would be good.
Yeah, I think it'd definitely be a good program to have in the future and talk about just the general design of a fungus, as well as some of the amazing things that you can learn from fungus, as well as these bigger questions around mushrooms as well. So,
and also as well, another good topic would be to tackle drugs as well. I thought that would be interesting. Like, did God give marijuana or magic mushrooms for us to consume? Is that a result of a fallen world? That sort of thing. We could explore that as well.
That's the big thing now, is going back to kind of the oils, essential oils extracted from plants. And our daughter got us started in it, and we found it to be very useful. Yeah. showing
Yeah.
that.
Well, it's also related to, there's the same question of things like toxins. You know, some of the most toxic plants in the world also produce the greatest medicine. So it's like, you know, you can, there's an answer hidden in there somewhere. But anyway, no, that's great. Thanks all very much for that. And thank you for all the questions. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes or so to answer some questions and run down through. Craig will have to drop out in the next sort of 5 minutes or so. So let's move on, Sam, to some more questions that we can run down through and have a chat about anything else that's come up before we bring it round to a close.
Or
Can I-
go on.
So,
I was just, can I do a brief advertisement?
Oh,
For the I want to do a road trip next year through central Victoria, New South Wales, and up into Queensland, and probably back down the coast. So if there's anyone out there that would like to host me at the church or youth group or midweek meeting or whatever, just let us know.
great stuff. Yeah,
That'll be June, July next year.
June, July. Great stuff. All right.
All right, then.
Yep, go for it, Sam.
Awesome. Well, we've got some thanks to give out first. We've got to give out a thanks to Doki Doki again, coming in with 99 US center, who's a smiling face with sunglasses. I'll have to just cover my eyes for that one. And I have no idea how I'm going to do this one. Douglas Boffey coming in with 5 British buckaroos, a Sheba dog clapping his hands. Arr, 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 arr. No, that's a seal, isn't it? Bork, bork, bork. How does a Sheba dog...
I don't know. What's a Shiba dog? But anyway, we're very grateful.
A Sheba dog. It's a Japanese dog, I believe. It's it sort of originates from Japan. And it's the name Sheba. You're still laughing about the seal, aren't you?
Yeah. So
Well, at least there you go. That's my role for this week's Creation Conversations. Right, here's a question coming from Doki Doki. This is an interesting one. Will there be farming on Mars someday? This brings to mind the novel and the film The Martian.
Yes.
With what's the botanist's name? It's played by Matt Damon in the film, anyway. But he's a botanist, and he gets left behind on Mars, and he has to survive. And he survives by growing potatoes in Martian soil, fertilizing it with human waste. But yeah, so that's interesting. It's an interesting
Elon Musk
topic.
is trying to do that, isn't he?
Yeah, I think
Nuking
so.
the poles or whatever, and
That would bring up another topic: is trophism. Just why do plants grow up? And one of the factors is gravity. And so I've got colleagues that were doing research on zero gravity plants because one of the problems is getting water and water movement and irrigating. And so, yeah, that would be an interesting topic.
I'd hate to be in charge of watering the plants in Mars.
yeah, I have to admit I'm not convinced of the colonization of Mars idea in general. As in, I'm not convinced that it's ever going to happen. But
here's my prediction: is that the Lord will return before we ever get anywhere close to thinking about that.
Yeah, we've messed this world up enough. Yeah, no, I'm not convinced. But anyway, it'll be interesting. It's interesting thinking about the
Mars bars.
Yeah.
Well, it gets you to think what is necessary for plants to grow, and that's actually good evidence for creation because it's not. You have to take into account the atmosphere, the soil, the water, even the gravity. I've never thought of that before, Glenn. That's really important.
Temperature.
And the temperature.
And the minerals in the soil as well.
And also, there's certain plants. I've tried growing semi-exotic plants in the UK before, right? Things like, pineapples, bananas, stuff like that. And even in greenhouses, even in heated greenhouses, they just don't grow very well because the daylight hours are not long enough.
Yeah.
Well, if we're going to struggle growing bananas in England, goodness knows what it'll be like trying to do it on Mars. Yeah, even with heated greenhouses, it's just not enough sunlight.
It's a thing about the research. Their research were on these airplanes, and you have to set up the experiment so that then the plane takes a nosedive and they simulate zero gravity, and they quickly have to do their experiment while they're simply falling and floating.
It's also interesting as well because
Not for me.
I was just thinking it sort of brings up the concept of the Goldilocks zone, doesn't it? You know how we are literally perfectly placed in terms of distance away from the sun for life to be able to thrive and exist and to become self-sufficient. You've got the the concept of Mother Nature, but the concept of words are escaping me, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
And
not too hot, not too cold,
not too hot, not too cold. You've got the right amount of atmosphere, right amount of oxygen. It's all perfect for life. But then, obviously, if you're going away to Mars, you've got less sunlight. You don't know necessarily what the soil conditions are going to be. Are we going to have to artificially put in minerals and fertilizer and things like that? A whole bunch of things, as well as the gravity. I didn't even think of that either. And then if we take one step closer to the sun, the gravity issue would become probably even worse because you don't know. I mean, we don't know because we haven't been there and tried it and tested it. But at the same time, we don't really need to go because we know that things are going to be so vastly different that it just won't thrive.
I think what is the motivation for it? Is it because people are so worried about their future on this planet that we need to start looking at another planet to colonize and grow things on? I think it comes down to your concerns about the future, and as believers, we don't need to worry about that. We know we've got a Lord that has got the future in His hand.
It's also as well it's wanting to become like God in a way, where they are basically going to be going to Mars and essentially creating a life-sustaining planet from a non-life-sustaining planet to become like God in Genesis when He created plants and sea reptiles, animals, humans, birds, insects, bacteria, the cell, DNA, all of that. The complexity, it's irreducible complexity, and it just all goes so well together. And yet,
the more we study it, the more it's just clear it took a genius beyond a genius to design all these various living organisms, and then they all have to function together and work together as an ecosystem. And it's a picture of how much God loves us, because He could have created it all very simple, very bland, and all one color and all one style and one design. But the variability in all of this intricate design is just mind-boggling.
Yes.
And then picture this. We're actually aliens on a foreign planet on this earth, because our citizenship is in heaven.
True. Yes, I tend to agree with Craig's point about I think the Lord will come before we've had any chance to try and grow plants seriously on Mars. And anyway, what would be the point? We're meant to live on this earth. It was created for us. They have tried to grow plants on the International Space Station, and I think they have partly succeeded by growing them in containers. And I don't know whether that sort of controls the movement of water and nutrients or whatever, but it strikes me as being extremely contrived. Much rather grow plants down here.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought we'd get all of that out of about botany on Mars? Goodness me. Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Shall we do another question?
Yes, indeed.
Craig, I think you've got to pop off now, haven't you?
I'm going to go. Yeah,
all right, see you, Craig.
All the best, Craig.
Let's move on to another question. This one comes in from Shokiwa. Question: have you heard of the idea that originally we were created to eat seeds/fruits pre-fall, Post-fall, they could eat the plants of the field, and then after the flood, could eat meat.
Go, Jeff, Joe.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, I'm just reading that again. Sorry. You heard of the idea that originally we were created
Yes.
to seed fruits pre-fall, post-fall
Yes.
they could eat the plants of the field,
Yes.
and after flood. Yeah. So right. Sorry. Yeah. Just so I had to read through that again for a second. Okay. Very quickly, and then I'll let Glenn and Diane have a comment. If you go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 30 and 31, we are told that all animals, all creatures, humans included that, were only given permission to eat plants. We were created to eat plants, and the plants were created to sustain us. And that's a point which a lot of people often gloss over. It's not just that we were created to eat plants, the plants were created to be good for us. All the herbs of the field were good for us in the beginning, right? There we are, that perfect reference. I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree that is in this fruit, you shall have them for food. Okay. Skip forward to Genesis chapter 3, you have the fall. Now, all of a sudden, human beings are going downhill. That's the old good to bad to worse, right? And so are the plants. Now, the plants are degenerating. But you've got to remember, this is still close to creation. You have minor degeneration, which is kind of accelerating as the years go forward. So you've got quite a while before the plants start to fall apart in quite the same amount that they have today. And it's the same story for human beings. You do have one other piece of information. We're told that thorns and thistles will come onto the planet, and that man will have to start to work for his food. No longer will it be a good world as it was originally created. By the time you get to Noah's flood, you find that the thought and intent of every man was only evil continually. So the world has gone from good to bad. And by the end of the flood, you find the first reference to climate change. For as long as the earth shall remain, there'll be seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, and winter. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to force diversification. It's going to force degeneration of plants. And so now the plants are no longer as good for you as they were in the beginning. And no longer are you able to digest the plants as well as before. Second point, you've also got erratic climates going on now. And God tells Noah to spread out into all the world, and his descendants to spread out into all the world and fill it. Now, they of course didn't, and they eventually did after the Tower of Babel incident, right? But you come to a very quick realization that if you're going to move and live on the frozen ice caps, you're never going to be able to be a vegetarian or a vegan. It's just not going to work, right? You're going to need to be able to eat meat in order to survive. And so you'll find at the end of the flood, that's the first reference that we find to God giving permission to man to eat meat. It says that everything that moves shall be food for you. At this point, we don't have distinctions between you can't eat the unclean, you can eat the clean. That's later, and for the children of Israel, that comes in Exodus and in the Levitical laws. But at this point to Noah, to all of mankind, he says you can eat everything that moves, but don't eat the blood. Right, that was the only stipulation. And you'll find that in the book of Acts, when the apostles and the disciples of Jesus were wrestling over, well, which of the laws do we keep, which of the laws do we not? They went back to that original covenant that God made with Noah and said, right, this is the one we're going to go with. You can eat everything that moves, but don't eat the blood, right? So yes, we were created to eat plants. It's not until after the flood that God in his mercy gave us permission to eat meat, because now we're told to spread out and fill the world. Now no longer is the world not very good. It's gone from good to bad to worse because of the effects of the global flood. Our bodies have gone from good to bad to worse. The plants have gone from good to bad to worse. So now we're given permission to eat meat, and we're told everything that moves shall be food for you. So you see this digression as well as God's mercy in allowing us to eat meat in that. But yes, it's true, we were not created to eat meat. We were created and commanded to eat plants, and it wasn't until after the flood that we were given permission. Now, were people and animals eating meat before the flood? Well, you certainly find evidence of scavenging towards the latter part of the flood, but I suspect that has more to do with the fact that this is a world which is being destroyed over the course of 150 days, and the final remnants of the animals are struggling to find anything to eat, and so you tend to find more evidence for scavenging than specific hunting and carnivorous behavior. But I wouldn't be surprised if even humans were eating meat before the flood, because at the end of the day, these were sinful people. Right? These were people whose only thought and intent of their heart was evil, so they couldn't care less about what rule God did or didn't say. So I do suspect, however, that it would be Noah who would be sticking to those commandments. And we know that there's a concept of clean and unclean by the time you get to Noah's day, because he took 2 of every unclean animal, but 7 of every clean animal. And if you look through the laws, you find that clean and unclean often has a lot in parallel with what the animal eats, right? Does the animal scavenge like a pig, or does it just eat grass like a cow? So you have some interesting connotations there, but yes, created to eat plants, only given permission to eat plants. Sin happens, sin changes the world, flood happens, flood changes the world goes from good to bad to worse, and our necessity and in God's mercy, he gives us permission to eat meat after the flood. So any other comments from the team?
Yeah, just that before the fall, before sin entered, they were still given work to do, to tend the garden. And
Yes.
so the work didn't have anything to do with the fall, but it did have to do, then the work became very difficult. The agricultural work, it was by the sweat of the brow. And that then it became work, and you start seeing the degeneration of the plants, degeneration of the animals as well. So genetically, then from that point forward, it wouldn't be as healthy or as good for you once the fall took place. But it was still the same plants. Before the fall, you could eat plants, seeds, fruits. It just changed how much work it was to do it. I picture the garden as you just walked along and just enjoyed it. And then afterwards, you're tilling and you're working and you're sweating. Looking forward to that new heaven and new earth.
Yes, indeed.
I want to taste that new heaven banana bread, because that's got to be some good banana bread.
I mean, I'm telling you, if you like bananas and you live in England, just wait until you pick them fresh off of John's tree in his garden and eat them. They're like beyond anything that you've ever tasted before. The flavour is incredible. But yeah, never mind. Right.
I'm amazed too at how much we're seeing this degeneration. We've got animals that are allergic to things that they were normally eating. You're seeing, I think, the accumulation of mutations, even in the animals. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to that new heaven and new earth where we don't have that.
Amen. All right. Let's. Any more questions, Sam, before we wrap up?
I've got one from Douglas Boffey. This is sort of an interesting one. When Noah got drunk, was that because the potency increased during the deluge?
Or because he's been on a ship for a year and hasn't had any alcohol in his system, or just
found, I'm just thinking,
found something that he didn't.
found something at the back of the
know
ark. Like, I forgot about this. What's up? No, it's an interesting question, actually. If you look at things like yeast and the production of alcohol, with things like grapes, the yeast is found naturally on the grapes, and so as soon as you start to mash your grapes and turn it into juice, there's very little you can do to stop it from producing alcohol. You have to actually artificially sterilize it in order to produce grape juice, which wasn't really perfected until the early 1800s, early 1900s. So as soon as you get juice from grapes, you're going to start to turn it into alcohol in some way. The content of alcohol is based on the content of sugar, so maybe that has something to do with it. You'll often find that if you start growing stuff in a climate which is unusual for that plant, or if a sudden climate change happens, you can kind of blanch the plant, force it into producing sugars at a higher quantity more quickly. So maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe the sugar content was not as high before the flood, and now in a new world, you're forcing a higher sugar content, which is going to produce more alcohol. I'm just speculating here, right?
A cooler environment, the cooler environment, usually they put up more sugars.
Yeah.
And so if he's now at a very higher elevation and he's not, that didn't exist before the flood, well, it could very likely have a much higher sugar content than he was used to.
And maybe it could be more to do with the way that, also you've got to bear in mind that when God created, there was a tending of the garden for sure. But you've got to remember that everything was good to eat at this point. Everything, right? So you could have plucked any leaf you want, any fruit you wanted, whatever, and eat it, and it's good for you. So what you wouldn't have to do, yes, you'd have to tend, but what you wouldn't have to do is produce stuff en masse. Get out of your head of this kind of like mass production that we see in farming and stuff today that leads to a lot of problems with agriculture. And so before the flood, before you have a mechanism for major climate change, yes, you have 1,500 years, 14 to 1,500 years approximately of the fall happening, right? Degeneration. But you don't have a major mechanism for climate change. So yes, the plants are slowly going downhill, but there's not that acceleration factor. So the majority of stuff is going to be good to eat. So you're not going to have to work that hard to get your food. You're not going to have to mass produce food in farms and so on and so forth. Then you have the flood, and then you have Noah coming off of the flood and settling in the land of Shinar. And he settles, and I think it's in Genesis 9, it says that he planted a vineyard. So you're now producing a large quantity of these grapes. And if you are from a farming or a gardening background, as I am, you'll know that you get to this kind of period in the sort of springtime, which we got to know as the hungry period, because your garden's not producing anything, right? So what do you do to get through the hungry period? You grow extra through the summer and the autumn. You have a harvest period where you harvest all this stuff en masse, which you wouldn't have to have done in a good world or in a world where the climate was perfect. And then you're having to preserve that food in some way. Now with our modern things, we can freeze and, can and whatever. But in the past, you wouldn't have done that. You would have mashed, you would have bottled, you would have jarred, you would have dried, you would have salted, right? And so if you're growing a vineyard and it's mass producing, you're now mass producing these grapes, which only are going to fruit at a certain time of year, unlike all the year round, like a lot of other fruits do in tropical environments. Think of figs. Or I remember going to John's garden in Australia, and he had 6-year-old tomato plants. Well, here in England, the tomatoes grow and they die, right? So now Noah's having to collect all these and preserve them in some way. So you're producing alcohol. If you're producing large amounts of sugar and you're bottling large amounts of this grape juice, it's going to produce large amounts of very high concentrate alcohol. And so it's all speculation, but you can still kind of see how you could get to that degeneration, which wouldn't have been there before because it wasn't necessary to mass produce this volume of grapes or wine or whatever before. So few thoughts. All right. Well, we're coming to the end now of our creation conversations. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back next week with On the Origin of Evil. Yes, I know we're sort of a little bit late for the Halloween time, but John needed to, wasn't able to make it today. He's having a well-earned break. So we'll be back with On the Origin of Evil. And we're looking at it obviously from a biblical point of view and looking at what is a concept of evil and looking for things like, when did evil start? Who determines what is right and wrong? Who draws the line in the sand? And all of that kind of stuff. So should be a good program. So do join us next week for that. And until then, goodbye and God bless. It's been great to have you all with us again. And we will see you all very soon. Any last words?
Botany. That's a good
Botany,
word.
there we go.
Yes, that's a good
Depend on
word.
botany.
Yes. Yes, go out and try a bit of botanizing.
Yeah. Be careful.
Botanize, don't colonize. There you go.
Anyway, catch you later, folks, and see you next
See ya.
time. Bye all.
Goodbye.